Welcome to my short little PowerPoint video, slideshow, discussion, talk, whatever, about our upcoming soda firing workshop at Worcester Center for Crafts. In this little video, I'll be kind of going over what the workshop actually is going to entail day to day, what surface options that you have, with glazes and flashing slips, that sort of thing. Some specific things to think about, including how many pieces you can make, things to think about, best types of pieces, etc. And we'll kind of go from there. In a separate video, I'll talk about the very specific surface options you have, the very individual glazes and flashing slips. In this video, I'll talk more about the overview of the workshop and the process. So, to get things started here, the pictures you see here are the actual kiln that we're going to be firing at Worcester Center for Crafts. On the left are the pieces that are going into the glaze soda firing, and on the right are pieces that have just come out. Just to kind of give you an idea of how many pieces are going to fit into that kiln and what it's going to look like when we fire them. First things first here. So, you need to make pots. How many pots should you make? It's a great question. In general, for most people, I would say that it's about 25 pounds of clay that most people go through in making work for this firing, for the amount of work that you can make. A bag of clay. How nice is that? But there are other ways to think about it. Generally, we say that you get 2 cubic feet of space in the kiln, or 10 to 20 pieces. All kind of random ideas. Hard to kind of define 2 cubic feet in your head unless you have a visual. And 10 to 20 pieces because it really depends on the size of pieces that you're making. Another way to think about it is that if you were to take one shelf, everyone gets about one shelf of work in the kiln. And this is how big the shelves are, 28 inches by 14 inches by 8 inches tall. So that's also another way to kind of define the amount of work that you can make for these firings. If your piece is going to be taller than 8 inches, you can kind of visualize it by laying on its side. Obviously, there may be some pieces that don't fit into 8 inches anyway, that maybe they're both taller and wider than 8 inches. That also is okay, but be aware that they're going to take up some of your space. We'll have places in the kiln for pieces that are specific like that. What type of pieces are best for the kiln? Well, first, let's talk about what kind of pieces are most problematic in different ways. The types of pieces that I often urge people to make, or to not make that many of, are low-wide pieces, like plates. And the reason being that they just take up so much space in the kiln. You can imagine how quickly some plates would take up that amount of space, especially if they are only going to sit flat and then have a shelf over them. Because that shelf is going to end up taking up as much space as your plates. So you're really losing a lot of space in the kiln by firing shelves, which isn't really what we want to do. We want to fire pots, not shelves. So those are often pieces I don't urge people to make. Now, if you really want to do something like a set of plates, you can stack them on top of each other and fire them like that. Obviously, you can't glaze all those surfaces in it, but you could still have surfaces in between while you were firing. Just a thought about it. Now, what kind of pieces are often best for these firings? Often these types of firings are really good for kind of taller pieces that have about 4 to 5 inches of space, because a lot of us are going to make mugs. These mugs, right, there's going to be a lot of space in them for some narrower pieces. Having those pieces kind of around, we're going to be able to fit a lot of them. Also, there's almost unlimited space for little guys, whether that's a shot glass or testers or small pots or little planters, that sort of thing. There's almost unlimited number of space for it. Now, if you make an unlimited number of pots, you might have to bring a gift for whoever's loading the kiln that day. It does take a lot of work for firing all of those pieces, but if you want to do glaze testers, That's awesome, because we'll have tons of space for them. Other kinds of things to think about are if you want to make groups of pieces that are going to fit together. Generally the size, you want to think about our posts that we're making. Generally our posts are going to be like 4 inches tall, 5 inches tall, 6 inches tall. So if you make them up to kind of those sizes, generally we're going to be able to fit them in pretty darn good. But I wouldn't worry about it too much. Mugs, bowls, vases, those things are great. Pieces with lots of surface area for that soda to interact with, those are going to be awesome. Again, personally, I do try to just not make that many low wide pieces for these kind of community firings in these kilns. We'll talk more about the very specific surfaces right after this, being the glaze and flashing slips and flashing in general afterwards. The other thing that I really, really, really would urge you to do is to mark your cone 10 pieces differently than you normally mark your pieces if you're working if you have worked in lower fire work before. The reason being, if you fire, something that fires to cone 6 even, into one of these cone 10 kilns, it's very likely that it will just melt into a puddle of molten glass. That ruins the shelf, it'll ruin the pieces around it, you're not going to make a lot of friends. Also will likely be charged for that shelf, which are not cheap, because it's your responsibility to make sure that if you're using a different clay body than the ones we recommend, that you make sure that it's okay. So I would really recommend marking your pots differently so that you're sure that those pots are going to be the pieces that you made with your cone 10 clay and not accidentally a cone 6 body or lower that's gotten in. It's very hard to tell the difference after they've been misfired. Sometimes it's hard to tell while they're still wet. Generally what we use is our the Laguna B-Mix 10. It's a very nice stoneware porcelain mix clay for these atmospheric firings. You can do a lot of different things with it. There are other clays that you can use. Again, you just need to make sure to check those clay bodies with someone who has some responsibility in the firing. Myself, Dot, Tom at Worcester Center for Crafts, to make sure that those clay bodies are okay. Because they really will cause a lot of trouble, and it's really sad when it does. Okay, making pots. Things to think about. This is kind of, in each of these little bullet points, I'm going to talk about in their own slides. So we need to talk about wadding, and that all pots need to be wadded. We'll talk about flashing and flashing slips. We'll talk about glazing. I'd urge just a liner glaze at the very least, but you don't necessarily need to. And then clean up and how the workshop is going to go. Wadding. So what happens in these atmospheric kilns where you're adding some sort of sodium into them? So in this firing in particular, most soda firings, we're adding sodium carbonate, washing soda into the kiln. In wood firings, the wood ash acts as this kind of extra atmospheric change, but also some wood fires will put salt in their kilns. That extra sodium in the kiln bonds with the surface of your piece, and it draws the silica and iron to the surface and creates a sodium silicate glass on your pieces. That happens everywhere in that kiln. Will happen on the bottom of your pieces. This piece isn't glazed, it's just that sodium has gotten into the bottom of this piece and had created this glossy surface. So your pieces, wherever they are, will stick. If you have them just on the kiln shelf, they will stick to the kiln shelf. So what we have to do is add wads to the bottom of these pieces to lift them up. You can see some pictures of wads here on the posts. So the posts also will have to get wadded. Everything that's going to be touching is going to be wadded in the kiln so that we can remove it from the shelves without ruining the shelves or your pieces. You can just wad your pieces on the bottom. We'll have kind of different types of wadding. We'll have just a high alumina wadding, and we'll have a more decorative wadding. So you will have to at least wad your pieces somewhere. The wadding, what it is usually a refractory material, in most cases alumina hydrate, mixed with clay. Often like a ball clay, fire clay, kaolin, something that is mixed together to create the wadding. It's pretty much a kiln wash recipe, but mixed as a clay body. What some other waddings have in them are extra materials. So that might be some iron, that might be some sawdust to help them more easily be removed. So the high alumina waddings will be removed very, very easily, but they leave generally pretty white marks on the pieces. But they're totally what I would recommend for wadding the bottom of your pieces. Some other pieces you may want to wad decoratively. If you're doing that, I would urge one of the decorative waddings that we have that, like I said, generally are that same alumina hydrate, usually some sawdust or silica sand, and often like a fire clay. They have less alumina hydrate, so you'll get less of that white mark, which is often why it's replaced with like sawdust or silica sand, so that the pieces are actually touching the wadding is actually touching your piece less, so it's more easily removed. Because if it wasn't there, it'd be very difficult to remove. Those waddings will take a little bit more cleanup, but it leaves them kind of a nicer mark, depending what you want to do. Again, if you're doing it to the bottoms, I wouldn't worry about it. Use the good wadding or the high aluminum wadding that's easy to break off. You'll thank me later. You can also use things like seashells to decoratively wad your piece, like you can see in some of these pieces here. Those seashells have a high calcium content, and so the glaze doesn't want to stick to them. You can put your pieces on a seashell, and then you'll have to wad the back side of that shell if you wanted to. And then as that glaze or slip comes, or surface gets created where that seashell is touching, it'll leave the imprint of your seashell. This also will take a bit of cleanup, but these kind of processes, they just do. So you can kind of see on this teapot here how this piece is up, and those little white things underneath the feet, those are the wadding that are lifting that piece up off of the shelf. If you're wadding right, if your piece is going to lean one way, so like if it has a handle, I would always put a wad underneath that handle, put it that way. Your pieces don't need to get wadded straight up and down. They could get wadded on their sides like that. That might cause your piece to warp a little bit, but you can lean into that. It's kind of a cool process. Obviously these bottles were fired on their side on seashells for that kind of decorative look. Other things to think about is that everywhere is going to get glossy, right? So if you have things like lids, like this teapot does, you will generally want to wad that too. So people will just kind of put wads on your lid and put it right in place there. You can also use a alumina hydrate wax, so just wax resist mixed with a lot of alumina hydrate to paint on those flanges so that they will be removed that as well. That'll prevent that soda from making that glass surface, but it leaves a very white mark, so you may not like that, but that is also another way to do lids. Just like in normal firings where you can't have glaze anywhere the pieces are going to touch, just assume everything is going to get glazed, so you have to treat it as such. You cannot wax the bottoms because the wadding will not stick to the wax. So what you generally will do is dip our pieces in glaze, then wipe off the bottoms to put the wadding there. When we go to put the wadding on, what we'll do is we'll take a little bit of glue, put the glue on the piece, take our wads, stick our wads right where those glue places are, put our piece down, kind of squish it onto the table so it's nice and steady, and that'll be great for it. I think that has covered wadding. Big takeaways: make sure that you have an area that every piece is going to be wadded. know that everything is going to get glossy, and know that we're going to wad everything. You can have glaze on your piece, and you could wipe away areas where the wadding is going to go and put those wads in the place where the glaze has been wiped away, like we would the bottom, but you could just do little circles if you wanted to. But if you put wadding just onto glaze, it will stick to the glaze. The glaze will stick to anything, we know that. So that's something to think about. Flashing. So what is flashing? So generally we refer to flashing as the change in our clay surface due to the addition of something in the atmosphere. Like I was saying, when the soda interacts with our clay body, it brings the silica to the surface to create a sodium silicate glaze. What it also is doing is bringing some of the colorants in your clay body into the surface there. So like this piece here, you can kind of see how it's nice and glossy on one side, a little drier on this other side, but how that color kind of changes around the piece. Same kind of with this one, or even this one, where it's very brown here and kind of gets much lighter here. So this is where it really kind of got blasted with some soda and it really lightened it up. That's what we're referring to as flashing. You can kind of think of the soda going through the kiln like a flame through the pieces, right? That's what's going to be happening. So it's almost like a river running over stones. So it'll kind of brush against and kind of curl around your pieces. That's how that's going to work, and that's how those surfaces are going to be brought out. The soda hitting the pieces can sort of both bring out that iron, and then if it gets hit really heavy, it'll start to really lighten it up and kind of mute those surfaces as that soda really builds up and creates more of a thicker glaze like has happened here. Same clay body. What are flashing slips? So flashing slips are just clay slips that we put on the surface of our pieces to bring out better flashing. Some clay bodies flash, most do to a certain extent. If they have any other additives in them, like iron or whatever. What I have found works the best for most firings is that using this B-Mix 10, just the regular B-Mix 10, and putting a flashing slip on that if that's the kind of surface that you want to do. They just, because they're formulated to bring out that flashing, they're going to be better than the clay body themselves, and we will have other options. If you think you're going to leave your surface bare, I'd urge you to put a flashing slip on those surfaces. Again, in that other video that I will be showing, I'll go through the specific flashing slips that we have access to. The other thing to really think about is with these flashing slips is if you are going to glaze them, or if you know or don't know. If you're not sure if you're going to glaze your pieces or not, then I'd urge you to put a flashing slip on them either way, because it will, if you choose not to glaze your pieces, they will look great. And then if you do decide to glaze your pieces, then it's okay. You can just glaze right over those flashing slips. I apply my flashing slips when pieces are bone dry before the bisque firing. That's when you get the best coverage of these flashing slips and they go on thick enough. Some flashing slips you can apply after bisque, but even those that you can apply after bisque, I think work better when applied to bone dry clay bodies. It also makes it easier to glaze on top of if you need to. So, talking about glazes. You don't have to glaze your surfaces, like we've been talking about. You can use just flashing slips. But you certainly can, and the soda will be really interesting with some of the glazes. The soda firing is somewhere in between a reduction firing and a wood firing, because often they're not there's not as much reduction happening as would happen in a wood firing. The glazes are much brighter. Also, the extra soda can make the glazes do some interesting things. Some of those interesting things are like crystal growth, like you can kind of see in this mug here, that will create some crystals that will want to form and spread in your pieces, which can be really interesting. The soda will often change some glazes as well. It will make some glazes grow these crystals. It'll make some glazes, when it hits them, flux more. It'll make them melt. It'll make them run. It'll make them more translucent. These things can be really, really interesting. That being said, you want to be a little careful about application of your glaze if you're, knowing you're going to put it in the kiln and get blasted with soda. At the very least, what I would urge you to do is to liner glaze your pieces that are going to be for food, whether that's a mug or a bowl or whatever. I'd at least liner glaze them so that you have a nice glazed surface to work from. If you know you're going to be using a flash and slip on the outside of your pieces, then I would urge you to liner glaze with a Shino glaze. Shino glazes often have soda ash in them, what we use to put into the soda kiln. So what happens is that clay body, because soda ash is actually water soluble, one of the few glaze ingredients that we use that's water soluble, and often specifically for these kind of Shino glazes or flashing slips, the clay body will absorb that soda, and then as that water evaporates, it deposits the soda onto the outside of your pieces, so that it can help influence some of that flashing, which can be really cool. I just love Shino glazes as well on the inside of pieces. It's very creamy, it's very light, it can do some interesting things, so it's a great liner glaze if you want to do that. That being said, there's lots of other glazes that you can do that are really, really interesting and can be really beautiful. Again, that other presentation I'm doing will show kind of all those options and kind of the kind of different extremes that these glazes can be. I didn't talk about texture a little bit when I was talking about flashing slips, and I probably should. I really love texture in these soda firings. You can kind of see that the way that soda hits these textural pieces really creates some interest in them. So it's also a great thing to think about. Smooth surfaces, you'll get that kind of nice flashing that kind of goes over the piece and kind of blends around it like that kind of stones in a river. And textured pieces will really highlight that kind of those textures, as the soda will hit the edge of that texture different than the deep parts. You also may have noticed that this piece has this pink spot on it. That's some blushing from the clay body and caused by the soda. There also, what probably happened was there was a piece with a rebay next to it, a glaze that has a lot of copper in it, and so that copper off-gases a bit and then causes this piece here to gather that copper and kind of reduce in that spot. Some other pieces and glazes might do that as well. And so that's going to be really interesting too. All part of being into this big kiln with not knowing what else is everywhere around it. You can also do both flashing slips and glaze. That you can do it kind of like half and half. You can do more decorative glazing. You can do some underglazing and glazes and bare areas, and then flashing slips all over. So that's why another reason I would urge you to just flash and slip everything and kind of decide how you want to glaze it afterwards, because the soda, the glaze, the flash and slip will all interact together really nicely in these firings, and you can see some really interesting combinations with all of that. So as far as the actual workshop goes, the day one of our workshop will be to finish wadding and glazing our pieces. We are going to try to get all of the pieces glazed before day one. You should be coming to day one, the first day of our workshop, with your pieces glazed. You can do that in Open Studio at the various studios that we have access to. But your pieces should be glazed. If your pieces need some touch up, you can do that before we start loading the kiln and touch up your glazes, but you shouldn't be glazing your pieces during that workshop day. We really are trying to get everything glazed ahead of time to really kind of fast track this process. Because in years past, that 90% of that day was everyone glazing their pieces and all at once, so it's a little crazy. So we're going to get those pieces done ahead of time. If you come with a piece that you forgot to glaze, that's okay. We'll make sure that you can glaze that as well, but we want to try to make sure that all of those pieces are glazed before the firing. What we will be doing that day though are wadding the pieces. We'll go through that wadding process again so that everyone is comfortable with how you're going to wad. And we will wad our pieces, glue the wads onto our piece and go from there. Remember, the bottom of your pieces cannot be, or where you want your wads to go, have to just be the bare clay. Can't be glazed, can't be waxed. If you're using seashells, so we have some other leeway, but still can't be waxed. And you need to be able to have them sitting pretty steady on it. You don't, want to make sure that they're pushed on there, that they're not on little rollers. The rest of that day, we'll be loading the kiln. We'll be kind of putting pieces out by size, helping whoever's loading the kiln put pieces into the kiln. We may be kiln washing some shelves as well as those shelves go into the kiln. It'll be a group process of learning kind of how these kilns get loaded, what we want to think about while we're loading the pieces, and how to stagger these shelves so that we get good consistent flow through the kiln during our process. Generally, that day, with us having glazed ahead of time, will take 3 to 6 hours. If everybody's been glazed and ready to go, it'll be less than that, or on the lighter side of that. Day 2, usually the next day, we'll be charging the kiln. What we mean by charging the kiln is actually putting that soda into the kiln. So you can see a picture here of, I believe it's Jim Bailey, maker of Bailey Kilns, putting soda into the kiln. How we'll do it at Worcester Center for Crafts is that there's a garden sprayer that's pumped up with a combination of soda ash and water that'll be kind of pumped up and then sprayed into the kiln. We'll take turns doing that. It'll off gas kind of a lot. We'll kind of clear out of the kiln room, take a breath, go back in, and then do it again. There's 4 portholes on the front that we'll be putting that in, and there's a couple on the back too that we'll decide if we want to put soda in as well. But generally we'll be doing those 4 holes right in with the garden sprayer. We'll talk about the specifics of that when we're at the workshop. What that will do is the pieces that get directly sprayed with the soda will have a lot more buildup, and then it will kind of transition out. So we'll have some really interesting effects all through the kiln. The way that this kiln has been built is that generally it's a pretty even firing, that generally most pieces will be pretty consistent through. That's being said, not everything is going to be exactly the same. Some pieces are definitely going to get blasted with soda and some pieces are going to get a little bit less, but we'll have a very, as far as these types of firings go, a pretty consistent firing that will have some really great pieces coming out from all over the kiln. As we're charging the kiln, we'll be pulling out draw rings. So that's what we have here. At the bottom, we'll have a little metal rod that will poke into the kiln. These will get loaded with the other pieces in. We'll pick it up, pull it out, and drop it in the bucket. That'll tell us how much glass surface is being created on our clay bodies due to the soda that we're putting in. This whole process is generally pretty quick, usually a couple of hours to get through it all and to put enough soda in. The kiln will have been fired all day and being held kind of near top temperature when we put that soda into the kiln. Day 3, our unload day, is going to be the exciting morning of Christmas Day, where we will unload the kiln. We'll take out all of the pieces kind of in a train and lay them out on the table and how they've been taken out of the kiln, so we can really see how that soda has interacted with the pieces in different places in the kiln fire. We'll talk about the pieces and if people have questions and results and all of that during that time. And then we'll be cleaning up. These firings and these processes take a lot of work. We'll be having to clean shelves, we'll be having to clean the bricks of the kiln, and then we'll be re-kiln washing the shelves. It's not easy work, I'll be honest with you. It'll be a lot of grinding, it'll be a lot of cleanup, it'll be kind of messy. If we all work together, it'll be nice and quick. But But will take a little bit of elbow grease. And this is just how these processes work. Wood firings, soda firings. That's part of the process, and part of being involved in these kind of community firings is that we all take a part in them. Again, this process should only take a couple of hours if we're all working together. It's also fun to see how this all kind of comes back together. So that's going to be our workshop. Day 1, wad and load the kiln. Day 2, charge the kiln and pull drawings. And then day 3 will be our unload day. If anybody has other questions, please reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything else. But it'll be a very exciting day, and I can't wait to see you all there. If you want to have more specific information about the glaze options and the flashing slips that we have and the differences between them and the range of colors that you can get with each of those glazes, check out the other video on the soda glaze surfaces, or just soda surfaces. Have a good one. We'll see you soon.